Alrighty, so preview smooth mode, right? So this is now slide number 5. Sorry if you're just watching the recording. We did not record the first few slides while I was talking about topology. So what we want to do with preview smooth mode is go into either edge mode, vertex mode works okay in this as well. And just notice that when you're moving things around here, right? I also have object symmetry on if I'm going to be manipulating the arms and legs and things, right? Notice that you get a different sort of result by moving things around in this smooth preview mode rather than just using the like looking at things in low poly, right? It's kind of like doing a little bit of a favor to your brain where, you know, in low poly, you're kind of looking at it like, and you have to do the smoothing yourself mentally almost, right? You have to like build it in there. It does create issues though in some cases, right? Like here, it's already like mashed some joints together. So smooth preview. So it's not actually putting those edge loops and things where you place them. It's just trying to create a softer shape here where it's, you know, it's going to allow you to see a little bit what the smoothing looks like once we actually hit the smooth button. But it is dangerous to have things like this where the loops are so close together. See if I can do a few levels to get back there. Right. Some people like to work in Maya because of this mode, because of this smooth preview, right, where you can just quickly like check back and forth. The other thing to note about this is that it gives you an idea of how smoothing will work in terms of beveled edges, right? And how edges become soft when they are smoothed. So just for demonstration, let's make a little duplicate of our guy over here. I'm gonna smooth him once, right? And then smooth him again, maybe. All right, and it's created some nice geometry in there, right? So again, this is why we like this extrusion method, right? It's because we can just smooth, 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 and then get to a high poly result faster. But we do lose, right, some of our silhouette in the process. So the way that you preserve the important lines, say that you want them to have like a bit chunkier thighs here, right? Like, or maybe the thighs are okay with the actual thighs here. If you bevel an edge, say, let me just do one at a time. So here's the bevel tool. And I'll turn the fraction down. It will cause the smoothing effect to be a bit sharper in that area. Maybe I'll move it closer here. Smooth twice. Right, so notice that while this one has a very like soft flow across them, right? When you have a beveled edge, it kind of will lock that edge in place a little bit better so that the kind of like the wireframe that goes around the character isn't like sucking it in too much, right? It's not like pulling it in like a piece of spandex so much as it is like now you've got something in your pocket or you've got something where you can see the a little bit more sharpness to it. So let's do this on the head. Maybe if say that we're not happy with how much the head is getting shrunk here, right? I can pick some edges along the top. Now the bevel tool is really finicky and it takes some time to figure out like exactly how to use it best. So don't worry if it's not your favorite tool or anything just yet. Where did my options go? So edit mesh, bevel, I'll go to the options here. So if I choose like 3 segments on these edges here rather than just one and hit apply, right, you can also decrease the width maybe to make it a bit sharper. So let's say I'm happy with this head shape, right? I'm gonna have like a robot character anyway for mine. And I don't want his head to get all rounded when I smooth, right? I bevel those edges, and now when I smooth, oops, right now the smoothing does not affect those areas so strongly, and it holds its shape, right? Because now it's adding more lines to that bevel. Now, this stuff here becomes an absolute nightmare when you are UV unwrapping, when you are animating. So we never want our, at this stage, right, we don't want our edges this close together. It does help to have them more evenly spread. But you can see how much of an effect that bevel had just on the head area versus the smoothed area. Yeah. So you can do that method with preview on, right? And see how much beveling you want to do in areas where you want to really like lock the silhouette in place. But also in general, we can take a model like this that has a good foundation and then just keep iterating on it. Like in game design, right? All of our ideas are about like making it slightly better, putting something out there and then going back to it and making it a little bit better rather than trying to do it all in one slog, right? Like our projects are just too complex and require too many pieces of software to do it all at once. So think about it in terms of that, right? That you're working towards something, but along the way, it's not going to be the prettiest thing in the world, right? Like this character is obviously not where I'd want them to be. But I do want you to experiment a little bit, right? You can also use insert edge loop to solidify certain areas, right? And then the edit mesh bevel tool. Just be careful with the smooth button because it is a very, very large hammer and it will crush your Maya. Like I will look in the next little demo here. Once we get a high poly character or a character that is going to look better when it's smoothed to a high degree, how fast it can crash your computer if you just keep smoothing it. So let's move on to this guy. So make sure I can download him. I'll pop this into chat. So you have a couple things to look at on this more advanced character. Sleepy bear here having a snooze. Oh, sorry. Oh. Not impressed. Okay, so next character Rooney. The screen here. So this one, I did some coloring of some areas on this character. Oh no, we're losing Cleo. Cleo. Just to look at what a very professional model looks like. Because what I want us to look at in this particular scene, lost Cleo cam. Is kind of how the edge flow across this character transitions from sort of lower poly areas or areas with large details into areas like the face, especially, and the hands with a lot of small details, right? So obviously we can't necessarily depend on our edge flow being even across the entire character because we need to preserve the form a little bit, and we also need, obviously more detail in these mitts here in our final model. The other reason is because when we are sculpting a high poly mesh, right, we'll look at, I think we can, I don't know if we'll get to it today, but we'll look at, we're going to look at sculpting today, but I don't know if we'll get into baking. But when you are sculpting, those applications like ZBrush, like Maya, like sculpting in Blender, sculpting in Maya as well, they all kind of require quads to work with. Now, ZBrush has a clever little algorithm where it can convert triangles to quads through some sort of magic. But say Mudbox, which is Autodesk's sculpting app, it will flag any triangles that you have in your scene right away if you try to bring it into the app, right? So if I have, say, even like one cut on the faces here, can do it, right? Say if I have just two triangles here, and I try to export this model into Mudbox, it's going to flag a warning because it doesn't know how to split a triangle evenly, right? Whereas with a face, if I smooth it, right, it knows, okay, I can just cut that face down the middle. I can cut it down the middle, both vertically and horizontally, and that gives me 4 squares. If I smooth it again, right, it just cuts those faces down to 4, and it can just keep doing this and doing this until you reach like millions and millions of faces, right? Faces being polygons here, not literally the character's face, right? So any part of the model here that I want more detail in, right, I can smooth those individual faces ad nauseum down to teeny tiny little invisible faces. And when we do that, right, that's what allows the program to be able to sculpt with a lot more detail, right? So that we can capture surface details, so that we can capture the curvature of the face in more detail, right? Without making the game engine, calculate all of these different vertices and polygons, right? We can still get a graphical representation of that through the normal map. So hopefully you guys remember how normal maps work. We can look at that a little bit more in detail as well. All right, so on this character, we can use this guy for sculpting. Not this guy, our high poly guy. And the other thing that I have in this scene are some examples of where the modeler has gone from a relatively simple area, like maybe it only has 2 faces or 1 edge loop between 2 faces, right? And they've taken that into 4 faces without using any triangles is the real key, right? So to practice, I've put just a simple plane here with two quads, 1 plane with 4 quads, just so that you guys can practice, right? Taking an edge, extruding it with, I just like to go to the move tool and hold shift, right? And seeing how you can get from these 2 edges into 4 edges, right? Where you need something to connect. So this often happens in places like the shoulder, right? Where I might have, in this case, 1, 2, 3 edges, but it needs to be narrowed down to 1 edge, right? So you need to start looking or training your eye, in a sense, to look for these, what we call poles, wherever a vertex doesn't have 4 edges connected to it, right? So a normal run-of-the-mill quad, right, will be here. If you have 4 quads, there'll be a vertex in the middle, and it has 4 edges, 1, 2, 3, 4 connected to it. Now, wherever there are fewer, like 3 edges or more, 5 edges connected to it, that's what we call a pole. And what it does is that middle vertex is sometimes less likely to animate well. So we put it in areas that are closely attached to a bone, right, on our body. So not something that's going to be moving around too much. Like the pole should go in, if you move your shoulder around and you put your finger here on your collarbone, right? That collarbone is locked in place on your body. It's not going to move around even though your arm is moving around. So it's a good place for a pole because it's not going to animate. Yeah, you have to UV unwrap and texture it. Don't worry, we'll get to all that fun stuff. That's why we're moving so fast on these, right? So I want you to notice on these high poly models, right, where these poles are kind of set, generally are going to be in areas that don't need to be doing so much motion versus areas that need to deform, right, are typically we're going to be more strict about having quads. So again, the poles are there just because we've had to move from a lower density area, like maybe only 2 faces, going into an area like a shoulder. And then as it goes down to the arm, we need more details in places like the hand, right? So what you'll notice going forward, right, is if you have a selection around, say, the wrist, right? And this is 20 faces around the wrist, right? But then just up the road a little bit, right? Now it has 26 faces. You're gonna have to do some clever splitting of the polygons, but we can't use triangles, right? Just because of the way that sculpting apps work. Now, for your first model, right, for these ones, and especially for non-art specialism people, you don't have to worry so much about all this stuff. I'm not gonna be like looking at your models with a magnifying glass or anything, but it will make the process go a little bit smoother if you watch out for this stuff at the early stages rather than having to fix it later. Oh, just heard a little grumpy sigh. Cleo getting back to the spot. Cleo cam back on it. Okay, so for this guy, we can do a couple things just so that we can jump into sculpting here. So keep this file, or maybe, oh, sorry, my internet is being a bit slow. I'm gonna delete all this stuff, and I'm gonna move this dude back into the middle. I can hold X, remember, to snap to grid, so that way I know that he's directly in the center. I'm going to go to assign existing material, Lambert 1, just to get rid of all those little blemishes on his body. And then for us to start sculpting, we are going to scale up this character to about 1,000 on the X, Y, and Z, right? So the reason for this is because when we go to the sculpting tools, right? So up here on our shelf in the top left, we have poly modeling. We've looked at curves and surfaces last semester or last year a little bit. We generally leave the poly modeling shelf open. If we swap over to the sculpting shelf and we check out all the sculpting tools that Maya has, right? Maya's got a decent amount of tools in here, all the basics. The first one is really all we're going to need. If I mouse over on my character, this brush is just way too ginormous, right? So if I start sculpting, it's going to do all sorts of weird things we don't want. Another thing to remember, not only for this tool, but for really any tool in Maya, is to double click on the tool. That will bring up the tool settings, right? So it's kind of like the brush settings in this case. Maybe I want to dock them here with the outliner. And that way, when I mouse over my character, right, I can change the brush size. However, I've tried this with what I would consider a normal size character that fits on the grid, and using a teeny tiny brush for sculpting still isn't great because then the strength also needs to be a teeny tiny number, and it's not really worth dealing with such small values here. So rather, again, I'm just going to go to object mode, scale up my character, and for me, I'll just type in the values here: 1000x, 1000y, 1000z. So the grid is a teeny tiny little nearly forgotten object. Now, If you get this problem, right, where the character is disappearing after certain zoom levels, right? This is distance culling that's happening. What we need to do is go to the outliner. So we go to Windows, Outliner to get to this. We click on Persp, which is the perspective camera that we're looking through, right? Like if we hit space, we can see our other camera views. But Persp is the perspective camera. So Persp here. We have something in, I believe it's in the attribute editor. It is called far clip plane. And you might have run into this in Unity if you have a really big scene, like an outdoor scene in Unity, where if I just increase this far clip plane to add a 0, now I can zoom way out again, and it's not going to freak out. Yeah. So Persp camera, attribute editor, far clip plane. Same if you are working really close up on something small. Sometimes you want to change your near clip plane value as well. All right, so my character is scaled up to 1000. I have fixed my perspective camera. If it was bothering me, if it's not bothering you, you don't have to worry about it. And then I'm back in the sculpt tool where now, right, I can change my brush to these larger values like 30, 40. What I want to also do is increase the strength. Let's see if it's making any difference, right? Let's see what's going on here. So when you start sculpting, it looks like I changed my direction value. You sometimes want to keep an eye on these. So average normal means that it is going to scale outwards from wherever that face is pointing, right? The perpendicular point of that face, it's going to move along a line, right? So that just kind of means buffing things up or like puffing things out, right? If I hold control while in the sculpt tool, it will do the opposite. It'll push things in, right? Flatten things out. I'm going to kind of be making a monster here, apparently. Right. And then the other one to remember is if you have too many details or too much going on, you can also hold Shift and brush over. Now it helps to have object symmetry on here, right? Object X symmetry. Because that way you can be working on one side and see what's going on the other side if it doesn't give you a clear view from your particular camera perspective. But again, if you hold Shift and mouse over, it smooths out the vertices, right? So wherever there's like a very sharp peak, it's just going to like round that out until it gets flat. For your guys' character, you really shouldn't need to push over like 6,000, 8,000 faces, right? So you can see your character's poly count by going to display, heads up display, and then poly count here and enabling this. Goat legs you can get away with. Same with like chicken legs, or reverse legs are a bit tricky. Like chicken legs, you might struggle a little bit with how they look, because what you're basically doing then is like a goat leg, right? Just break open a right, being a leg that goes kind of backwards first. Right. Oops, I still have symmetry on. Right, and then comes down like this, and then has like a foot. Right. What we're gonna have to do to trick Mixamo is we're gonna have to tell it that this up here is the knee, right? So we're gonna fool Mixamo into bending this part when it wants to bend the knee. And then this down here will be the ankle. And then this is more just like the toe. And, evolutionary scientists have already proven that in mammals that have this reverse leg, that's actually how they evolved, is that this bottom part is their toe, right? The hoof is basically an evolution of our like big toe. I think it is. I'm pretty sure it's down there. Yeah, that's, sorry, I'm wiggling. You guys can see me wiggling my toes. Yeah, so some animations will work okay, right? Like you can get away with a little bit, but you might end up having to animate the legs or animate the whole character by hand. We will be doing our own walk cycle / run cycle for the character. So you'll have some experience working again with like a character rig. And then it's not so bad because say, if on something like this, when we want to add bones, it's just a matter of like drawing the bones in here. Just go to skeleton, create joints, bone, bone, and then toe, right? Here, skeleton, key. So when you're creating it, there's no difference to creating it, but you might have an instance where you're gonna have to actually like hand animate some of the character rather than being able to, use Mixamo right off the bat, right? So you're taking a bit of a risk. It's worth testing it out when it is still in the low poly mode before you get too deep into to making your own character. Making hands. Yeah, we'll have its own session on hands. I actually have a good hand making video on on that YouTube link already, and also there are a few videos online that help with that. So yeah, hands, much like the face, it's almost like doing an entire character from scratch. Okay, back to sculpting. So on this character, right, we could also, if you want to use Blender for sculpting, Blender's sculpting tools are pretty good. Say I have a character over here, right? It even has the same icon because they basically stole all their tools. No, but Blender, right? Same exact thing. You can turn on symmetry over here somewhere. Where is symmetry mode? See, the problem with me using Blender is now I have to keep two sets of software running in parallel in my brain. There's symmetry way down here. So you have access to all the same tools in Blender. You can decimate, which is the same thing as smooth, to get more geometry going, right? But really it's doing the exact same thing. It's figuring out the perpendicular angle on a face, and then it is just like raising it or lowering it based on the tool that you use. Top right. Oh yeah, these guys here, these tiny little icons. Yeah, this is maybe also why, because I'm not such a huge fan of Blenders, because I mean the icons in Maya are already teeny tiny. So like teaching something where the icon is that small, it's like I feel bad for students because you're gonna have to be running it at 1080p at least just to see some of these icons. The nice thing though that they've added to Blender is that now when you first boot up Blender, it'll ask you for shortcuts. Do you want the Blender shortcuts or do you want industry standard shortcuts? And for me, right, all of my muscle memory is in Maya shortcuts. So if I choose industry standard, now when I hold Alt and left click, I pan, right? When I am in modeling mode or layout mode and I hit W, right? W is the move tool, E is the rotate tool, and R is scale still, right? It still doesn't work quite the same for some reason, the default scale. But it's a bit of an easier transition going back and forth now because in last year's Blender, or maybe it was 2 years ago when they didn't have the industry standard shortcuts, you're gonna have to like relearn all of your shortcuts, like pressing G. For some reason, Blender is in love with the letter G by default. So you have the option, again, if you want to sculpt in Blender, we just export this guy as an FBX, right? Or an OBJ compatible file type. And then in Blender, you could just do file import, and then you have to tell it what type of file type you're going to be using, FBX or OBJ. But pretty much the same deal as we've got here in Maya. So if I want to start sculpting this guy, again, first thing I want to do is I want to decimate or I want to smooth this character. So tap the smooth button. I double check the faces now, because remember, every face that I smoothed, I now had 4 times the amount of faces. So when I smooth an entire character, I can see his poly count now is 10,688. I can also, that's modeling, if I want to do several smooths all at once, right? I can click on the mesh menu, go to the box next to smooth. I'll bring up a little menu and I can say, okay, I want you to smooth them like 3 times, 2 or 3 times. See, it only lets you go up to 4 in the tool because it knows how unstable it is. So say if I want to smooth them 3 times, now it's going to be like 10 to the power of 3, kind of like when I'm multiplying this. So it's going to smooth first, right? The first level to 42,000, the second level 170,000. And I can generally get away with, I tested this last night, up to around like 2 million, I think it was stable. 2.4 million, it was a bit slower. It's not that it's slow when you're in viewport mode. When you're not selecting anything, it's fine. But when you have the character selected and wireframe is selected and it's having to draw all of these polygons, right, on the character. So here you can really see these poles, right? So now those positions that I had colored on that character, you can see that it creates really nice, smooth quads all the way through the character. And then those pole areas get more and more concentrated into tiny little spots, right? So they become more and more pinchy in those areas. That's why we have to watch out for where we put them, is because now those areas will be more susceptible to having weird deforms when they do animate. This is a decent number of polys here. What have I got? 680,000 polys. Right, if I push them up once more to 2.4 million, it's going to go a bit slow. So let's just leave them around there. Then with the object selected, sculpting tab, go to the sculpting tool. Now I can also tell it, I believe, whether I want to show the wireframe, show or hide down here under display, right? Which sometimes helps to see once you've got a little more detail in there, right? So if I want to say add some spiky bits to this character, oops, increase the size, and notice that as I start to stretch these pixels, right, like one of the disadvantages to using Maya or even Blender is that notice what it's doing, right? It's just pulling more and more verts, more and more polys outwards from that character until you get really blocky results, right? Even though this character's got tons of polys to work with down here, now because I've made this mountain on him, it's gone down to the point that now he is suddenly low poly again. So ZBrush deals with this a little bit better than other apps. Let's see, we can also try some of these different, which one is it called? Dynamesh. Yeah, Jamie, we all know you like ZBrush. So this is why ZBrush is the modeling standard, right? It's because it doesn't make you deal with this stuff as much, but it's an easy fix as well. In Maya, we could just select this one area, and we could use the smooth tool on it if we want, right? And that'll just decimate those into quads. It's not a very good way to do it though. There is a sculpting tool here to build up a surface, maybe. I don't really worry too much about this high poly stuff, except for once I've done my low poly. Accentuate details. No. So this can become an issue, right? And this is why we try to keep our, what we call our base mesh, close to what we want our final silhouette to be, right? Or our final detail levels. Because of this problem where things suddenly, you kind of run out of polys once you start to add too many details. So really, the way to do it would have been to create, say, a cylinder or something, and just like attach it to the model early on. With like Boolean, right? Back when he was low poly. And if I wanted this, if I knew that I was going to have this shape coming up, right, then I would have that in my base mesh. So that's why I want you guys to work from these low poly models first and get the silhouette, the big shapes in place. And then if you want to go into the sculpting side of things, it becomes a lot easier to add some nice surface details without necessarily having to deal with the tool breaking a little bit, right? Like to give you a hard time. So again, this stuff, especially the smoothing, it's not going to be super necessary for 90% of you. You don't really need to go this deep into character modeling, but if we're looking at the kind of correct ways to do it, right, it's definitely worth looking at because it is the way that the pros will work. So in a professional environment, you typically have some sort of base mesh, whether you get that from somewhere, like for example, Maya has some base meshes built in, or if you download it here. So the built-in ones are under the generate menu, get brush. Then if we look under modeling, sculpting, base meshes, bipeds, we can get some different character options, right? So if you want to do, say, your goat character or female character, right? We have some really nice base meshes, again, that are professionally modeled. So notice this one as well, very nice edge flow across the model. Therefore, we know that when we smooth him, he will keep his shape almost perfectly, right? And this one has the reverse legs here. So again, remember, this is now your ankle way up here, and your foot is really just the toe when it comes to putting it into Mixamo rigging. All right, so we've got female base mesh, we've got a werewolf, we've got some heroic aliens and things, all of which are good candidates for sculpting because they smooth so nicely, right? Like when we smooth, we don't get that massive amount of change in the silhouette from our box character to our smooth character if the base mesh has been sculpted in this correct way. Yeah. So typically in the industry, there are people who make base meshes, right? Just and sell them to the high poly crew who like to just sit in high poly and sculpt pretty things, right? Sculpting is more creatively free, right? You're not weighed down by all of these like rules and things that you have to follow and keep your poly count down and blah, blah, blah. Like you're a lot more free. And there are kind of different sets of rules and different tools that you use to get your high poly. So there is some often like a split in the roles there. There's usually going to be one person who deals with the base mesh, another person who deals with the high poly. If you can do both, that means that you're doing two jobs and your pay should reflect that, right? So if you master both of those skills and you can take a low poly and turn it into a high poly, right? And then go back to low poly as well, that means that your work is worth more, right? Versus somebody who has to, go buy a base mesh online and then work off of it, or builds a base mesh but doesn't really do the high poly stuff, right? Remember that there are these divisions in the industry where you become a specialist in that job, and just in sculpting or just in texturing. Once you start to add more of those to your repertoire, it just makes you more and more valuable to employers because they're going to have to hire fewer people, which means less team dynamics and things. Be aware though that if you're very slow at one of those stages, it doesn't count as being able to do it, right? Because if they can get it done, if the person next to you can get hired and get it done 4 times faster than you, yep, wreath topology is a full-time job for sure. It's going to be worth the company to just pay that person, that way they're only paying 200 pounds a week for a model to get out, rather than if you're a bit slower and they're having to pay you the same hourly rate, it might cost them 1,000 pounds a week just to get the same stuff out. All right, so I wanted to show you guys the next step here because we're gonna let sculpting take a back seat for a while. We'll come back to it down the line. Again, I like to introduce these things early on so you kind of know why we sculpt or why we build things using this low poly style and then move into high poly later, right? But once we have done some sculpting on a character, we do the actual retopology, right? Because the issue being that once we have gone to a high poly mesh, right, of say 600,000 or a million or 10 million or whatever crazy number, this is no good for a game, really. I mean, we can fit maybe a couple of these on screen, but think about the poor people, people out there running it on like a GTX 1660 and things that are like baseline gaming computers, not going to be happy pumping a bunch of these out. So one of the tools that arguably is superior in Maya than a lot of places, although Blender is catching up like with many things, is the quad draw tool. So over here on the right where we have our channel box layer editor, we also have modeling toolkit. So if we are now at a high poly model and UV unwrap on this guy. So it does maintain its original unwrap, right? It's got the cuts along those edges, and those edges typically still exist. Right? Again, Red, this is another reason why we like the base mesh method, right? So because we've put in, say what they would have done, right, is they would have opened that model. Let me pull up my old one. They would have unwrapped that model back when he was only, what was he, like a few thousand, 6,000 polys or whatever he was, right? That's when they would have unwrapped him using, like selecting edges here and making cuts, right? Once you cut that edge, right, say if I'm in UVs on this guy, I have some unwrap on him. It's a little bit hard to see. So let's say that I made cuts here in my UV space. Let me just switch my brain over to unwrapping mode. So say I cut this seam, right? Even though I smooth out this model, right, that cut remains, right? You can still see the slightly brighter line here, right? And you can see what's happening here in the UV mesh. It's keeping those original edges kind of in place and then just adding more detail, right? It's cutting the squares within those squares. Does that make sense? So it's keeping the material cuts, right? Like if we're thinking about it like a shirt again, it's keeping where the cut is and it's separating those UVs, and then it's just cutting all the squares within that UV space down and down again. So the magic happens, right? Once you have your high poly with a sculpt on it, we'll look at baking hopefully next week, is that you can take that high poly information and kind of like layer it on top of the low poly. So even if your low poly face only has like 4 faces on my hand here, say it's like just cut this way, you can take a high poly face that has like 100 cuts, right? And layer it on top of there and then kind of like shoot light through it. And it will determine the areas where there's a gap between those 2 faces and then raise up or give the illusion of raising up or lowering the bottom face, right? Just through normal maps. So I'll post a video that goes over normal maps a little bit more in detail, but this is kind of where we're at in the industry in terms of our workflow, right? Of like, we work in the low poly, we deal with our UV unwrap generally at that stage, or we retopologize, which I'll show you now. A little bit of slowdown here because I'm in UV shell or UV mode. Object mode. So, oh, fatal error. I knew that was going to happen. UV editor and high poly. We don't typically touch the UV editor, so let me go over here rather. Another scene. Character, demo character. All right. So again, on this guy, right, in this case, space mesh has been taken care of. So he should have his cuts just like so. And then any time that we would smooth him, right, it would just make cuts within these existing cuts. It would keep the UVs where they're at. But another thing that that we typically do now, right, is we skip this whole base modeling or like low poly version of the character, because it's extra time that a lot of the sculptors don't even need, right? Like oftentimes the sculpting crew are happy to just work off of like a blob, and they can extrude and extract and move things around to the point that their tools are so powerful that they don't really need this base mesh that we're using to get to that same high poly result. So it's chops a whole chunk out of the pipeline, which speeds up your workflow, right? But then what you need to do is to kind of rebuild the polys on top of the high poly mesh. So say, if this is my high poly and I'm at even at like almost 14,000 faces, right? For a mobile game, my art director might say, no, that's too much. You need to get the faces down to 3,000 faces, yeah? We use what's called the Quad Draw tool over here. Again, modeling toolkit, Quad Draw. We have to, before we open it, we have to be in object mode on our character, and we have to hit this little magnet icon underneath mesh display. That turns this into what's called a live surface. And then by clicking on Quad Draw, now I can draw polygons on top of this character and create new edge flow just by clicking along the surface, right? So these polys are all hugged onto this 3D surface. And if I create things that go around corners, right, it's a lot more intuitive to figure out like where my polys are going than having to extrude and like think in different angles, right? And think in low poly, right? So modern workflow, usually, if you are the low poly person, you'll get delivered this high poly model, and it might even come from like a 3D scan. Like maybe I can show you guys one of those that I have, where a friend of mine sent me a 3D scan that his buddy did, and then wanted me to do a low poly just so that they could actually animate it. So let's look at it. Demos. Oh. It's a little bit buried. Maybe I'll dig that up next week if we're going to do it in a little more detail. So this way with the quad draw tool, right, it becomes a bit easier to see where you're going to need detail or how things are going to connect, right? So what I'm doing is I click on the surface, right? It's placing these points onto the live surface, and then I hold shift and it will give me a little preview of where that polygon is going to be. And then I left click once to commit that poly. And then if there is an opportunity here where there are already vertices, right, I can click and make 2 new ones and then hold shift. It'll figure out how those verts might be connected and create a quad from the other available vertices around it. Yeah. So if you're just clicking through, right, you can end up going quite fast. And then you also see, where you might need more detail or less detail or might need a pull. You can also hold control to split polygons in half and it will insert edge loops, right? So here, for example, I don't really have a way to connect over here. So I could split this poly holding control. That gives me an extra vertex here. I can also grab individual vertices and move them around and they will still hug the model, right? So if I take this vertex that's up on the shoulder, and I move it down to the arm, it's going to stay locked onto that surface and move along it, right? Like a little bug across the body. And again, I can get into mode where I'm looking to see where I need more or fewer edge loops. Yeah. Now, there's also a way to delete, but the last one that I want to show you real quick is to smooth this out. Another really handy one is like, when you're just thinking in terms of like getting some polygons up here. No, I probably could have turned on symmetry for this as well. But when you're just putting stuff up here, right? Like sometimes you don't have such a nice topology. Your edge flow isn't so pretty. My favorite part of this tool is holding shift and brushing over these polys, and it just creates like such nice edge flow for you. That it makes this tool a joy to work with. So a lot of people, even from outside apps like ZBrush or Blender, will use Maya for this tool because it is so satisfying. Although, like I said, there are options now in Blender and things. Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat there. Right. Okay, it's good. This is especially important on the face, right? So you don't typically want to be like having to extrude and cut a face up from a character. It's better to have a nice sculpted face and then to have this live surface, right, where you can just place vertices and paint shapes across the face. Now, we'll look at the face a little more in detail in coming weeks, but typically a face, to animate a face, right, and to make it able to animate in the future, we're going to need loops around the eye here, at least one loop here, and loops around the mouth as well. That way, when those objects deform, right, as the mouth moves around and the eyes open and close, right, that when they do need to animate and stretch and things, they found that these kinds of round shapes that encircle the mouth and encircle the eyes, right, are going to give the best deforms rather than having any triangles in here, or if it was just like cut down the center like prison bars or something, they end up having some weird deformations. So we'll look at sculpting the face and things later. But once you have some sort of result with your quad draw, you can just deselect it. I'll typically turn off the live mode. And then these are now just pieces of geometry by themselves, right? So this is a new model, essentially, that is separate than the 3D model. And what we'll do next week, right, is I'll show you guys how to bake this high poly information so we get this really nice smooth changes in direction and lighting, catching the model, right, onto something that is quite low poly, right, where there isn't really any surface detail on this. As I pan past it, there's no real changes going on. Versus on a model that has been baked, right, which we can actually see if I turn on texture mode on this guy, right, he has an even higher sculpted version of him already baked onto this model. So if you hit 6 on your keyboard, right, what this is a normal map is already on this character through his UVs, right? So if I go back to his UVs, selecting him, and I was to, let's see if I'll just let me show this. Normal map doesn't body TIFF. It's just hard to see with the wireframe on. But this character already has a normal map on him. So right here is the file. Maybe I can just browse to this file and show you guys what that looks like. Where somebody has already taken him as a base mesh, right, at this, what do we say, like 10,000-ish polys, right? They've pushed him up to that 1 million or 2 million poly count, sculpted all these nice details like these washboard abs that this dude has now got, right? And then when you bake the high poly back down into a texture, into a normal map, right, it adds another level of detail onto his surface, right? So again, even though, say, this area has some detail, but not very much, once you turn on the normal map, right, it catches the light and you can see that there's additional detail on this character in the high poly sculpt that is then affecting, again, like the height information of the low poly underneath. Yeah. So even though this character, now being about 10,000 tries, has the detail level almost of, a 40,000 try or 40,000 polygon character. Yeah. So that's how we get like really gorgeous characters like in Cyberpunk or like in Red Dead Redemption or, Dark Souls and things like that, where they have really top end character artists, right? Is they go through this process of sculpting all these great musculature details, all the face details onto a high poly model, because it matches the UV layout of the low poly, right? And they've spent the time making the low poly model. Generally, these days after the high poly model, right? To make the model more efficient. It just gives us the impression that we're looking at better graphics than the poly count would really allow in the real world, right? So that's the joy of normal maps, right? Is that we get a lot of little surface details, and even this isn't really indicative of how nice this character looks, right? Like if I was to put a light in here and render him, kind of playing with fire to try this, but let's see how it goes. Then, because the viewport render is quite basic, really. If we were to render him in Arnold, maybe we'll get some sort of result where we can actually see his surface details a little bit better. Where we can actually see the normal map, right? A little bit. It's gonna be more obvious in Engine, yeah, or in a render. But again, like we can see those differences when we hit 5, 6. I'm not sure why this particular model is showing all these seams here. It's probably something to do with how Maya has interpreted his hypershade. Really, I think if we were to hook up this normal map again, it shouldn't really freak out so much. There it goes. That's really sharp. There you can see his face. A little bit of a. Okay, so it's using it as a bump map in this case. That's why it's looking a little bit freaky. Out color that I need. No. Anyway, the last thing that I wanted to look at, guys, before we call it, is this little file, which has the series of what I've just called arms, like kind of elbow joints, just to look at how different topologies will bend when we add cuts to those areas, and how many cuts is too many cuts. So the first thing I did in this file is I turned on wireframe on shaded mode in the shading menu. Then I also turn on X-ray joints in the shading menu. That way I can see where these joints are and select them a little more easily. So what I have here are some just default rigged elbow joints that I wanted to show you guys the different pinching problems that can happen if you don't have enough geometry, or even when you have kind of too much geometry in a sense. Right, so how much pinching will happen when you have certain shapes like a cylinder, in this case only a 5-sided cylinder, how the geometry on the inside especially squashes down, right? Because that's actually changing the volume of the object, right? Like it's going from being this wide to now like shrinking down, and like our hands don't do that, right? When we bend our fingers, it stays the same width all the way along, really. So this file is just for visual, right? So that you can see like what difference it makes. And really the best happy medium happens usually at 3 cuts, kind of close together. That's why when we've been looking at like knee joints, right? If you're thinking about it like a knee, something like this, where we have 1 cut down the middle, we have 1 cut above the knee and 1 cut below the knee, right? This kind of setup is going to give us a relatively acceptable amount of pinching. What you can do to get an even better result, though, is to kind of pre-pinch it, or in the geometry, what we do is we will add, or we'll weld some vertices together. So for instance, let me just make a new little knee here, insert edge loop. What we'll do is, if this is the side, right, that's going to be bent, like here, in vertex mode, we'll go to target weld, and we will merge the back of the joint together, right? So that you get this kind of shape. Now, you'll also notice this sometimes on like the fingers of models, where since we don't have those additional cuts, right, it's not going to create this pinching deformation. But for our purposes, and even on professional models generally, looks like this guy's only got the single cut style, which is fine, right? It's more common nowadays for us to just keep the quads as evenly spaced as possible, and then to deal with some of the skeletal problems in the rigging and skinning phase, right? When we're actually adding the skeleton to the model, right? The skeleton will go in there and generally just be the same shape. Let's see if we can get a quick rig. This guy. Guides. And then we'll deal with like smoothing out the skin so that when it is animated, it is going to look a lot smoother. All right, looks like we're getting some slowdowns there. So it's 11:30. It's pretty much all I wanted to run through today, guys. Again, I know it's very technical, especially if you're hearing this for the first or even the second or third time. It's a bit daunting. Mainly just think in terms of squares, right? Quads is what the application likes to use. Being careful with how many cuts you're adding is going to save you a lot of headaches down the line, right? Being very conservative with how many polys you're using at this stage is going to help you once you get to UV unwrapping and to skinning your model. If you do push your model into the thousands and thousands of polys range, like this one, even at 12,000 polys, there's a lot more vertices that you're going to have to worry about in skin mode. Looks like it created my guides, but my gizmos are really teeny. And so you're just making your life a bit harder, if you let's see if it fixed. Okay, no, it didn't figure it out. All right, it's a quick rig. Quick rig just failed in skeleton. Oh, because it's facing the wrong way. No skeleton. But Mixamo, right, is really our godsend because it saves us from having to use quick rig and from, in the generation before that, where we'd have to actually like create all the joints in the character by, clicking through start from the waist, work up the spine, up the neck the head, right? We're also skipping facial animation just because it's a whole other can of worms, right? If we're creating facial animation, we need to have bones for the eyes. We need to have multiple bones in the mouth to drive the mouth. We'll kind of avoid all that and let Mixamo do all of our rigging for us. And then we're going to edit the skin on those Mixamo rigs in order to make them nice. But for this week, right, in addition to just those of you that are moving ahead with your model or practicing, doing some practice runs with your model, right, use some of these practice files just to get a handle on things, just to get your head space where it's not so intimidating to work in 3D. But especially for UConcept folks, and even more for folks that it's facing the wrong way. Cleos. We need to make sure that we have good concept art to work from, right? That's going to create our best results for our base mesh. And then for those of you that are very ambitious and art specialism, right? Not every art specialism needs to go for the high poly mode, but it's good to test yourself, right? And to practice these kinds of things just so that you understand the workflow. But try to create a cool concept piece for your character this week, right? Try to nail down exactly what you're doing. It doesn't have to be a turnaround yet. We'll aim for the 6-week break that we get that one finished, but try to do one that captures what you're going for, right? So for me last year, I was playing around with characters for a while. This one was the one that kind of like grabbed me in terms of like, this is what I want my character direction to be, right? This is kind of like shows that he's got a helmet and he's got these armor pieces and then he's like a very aggressive character. So sometimes like a personality pose or an action pose is going to capture the essentials of your character, right? More than if you get too technical into the like building it on top of a turnaround. But we've looked at a few methods of getting a character started, right? Where you can go off of a new version of my guy. You could go off of like a paper doll style, right? Like I gave you guys all of those orthographic views that you could work off of and build a character kind of on top of some existing anatomy. So orthographic boys, right? So having something like this, especially a full turnaround, right, with all the anatomy in there, can really help if you struggle with drawing, right, especially, and give us some shapes to work with. Just make sure that you're not tracing over it, rather work next to it, or if you are going to draw things on top of it, make sure that you're replacing all of the line work at some stage so that nothing underneath is showing when you get to the final stages. So we'll get to a cool character turnaround later. Just remember, we're going to need a front view and we're going to need a side view in a relaxed pose. Before we start modeling, please hold off on modeling if you can. If you're going to go ahead and model, those are the folks that I expect to be like sculpting and things. If you're going to do, does the full body have to be one color, then 2 colors? Pick your 2 colors, right? That kind of represent the character's personality early on at this stage. Remember, black is not a color and white is not really a color. So you want to find accent colors, right, that are going to work on top of that. Same with like brown. Try not to use brown as necessarily a main color, right? Or if that's just a material, assume that you can dye the brown color to a different color. So we looked at a bit of color theory last week, right? look back at those slides if you need to. Another website that I find really useful is color.adobe.com. Another thing that they've borrowed or bought from somebody. Oh gosh, really Adobe, not everything has to be a tutorial. When you pick colors, I recommend using complementary colors, right? Which are literally opposites on the color wheel. So say for my logo, actually, I've done this where my primary color is almost like a slightly purplish blue. And then my secondary color is almost opposite, where it's like a complementary orange color, right? So you want to have contrasting colors, right? It creates a lot of contrast, but it also brightens up both colors in a sort of trick of the eye. So you can use things like these different color harmony rules, they call them in Adobe. I don't know anybody's actually used that phrase before, but complementary colors is typically what we think of in these terms, right? Where if you find a color that you like, right? Say if I want like a very energetic character like Pikachu, you know, yellow, maybe you want to have a complementary color like blue, which will contrast nicely with the yellow and also bring out the color a little bit more, right? A red, in Pikachu's case, also works nicely for contrast, but yellow and red being so close together that they kind of build on each other in a different way, or you know, we get tempted to use orange as well in that case. So color.adobe.com, it's a handy one for picking a color for your character, and then pick a secondary color using the 70-30 rule, right? And then maybe 10 if you want a third color. It should only be like a few little highlight areas, yeah? Cool. So that's all I got for you guys today. I will upload this lecture. I'm sad that I missed these first parts, but maybe what I'll do is I might record them again the afternoon session. I would like to see your guys' progress, so please, I hesitate to say everybody, but kind of everybody needs to DM me to show me your character idea, where you're at. And then I definitely need your storyboards posted. So I think storyboards can be posted in the channel, in our organic modeling channel, just to save my DM headache a little bit. Again, what I specified last night was that I want the storyboards to be split up. So I'd seen one that was kind of like all on one page without any lines between them. Remember, the storyboard actually defines where the edges of the camera view are, right? So if we're in 3D, right, looking at a character, this is our shot, right? Like the edges of our character, of our storyboard, also define the camera's view and where the camera is in space. Yeah, so sometimes you get these weird ones that have like crossover, but we want more like this. Then what we're gonna do, I thought we might do it today, but I think we'll hold off on this, is we can either do this on like a video editing software on our PC, but it's actually probably gonna be better to pull out our idiot boxes, our phones. Either just transfer the images onto your phones or like take a picture of your screen. You can either edit it on like a phone video editing app is worth investigating. You know, if you your phone should have something built in that lets you kind of string together a video. But also, what I realized, the very low budget way of doing this is just going to be to like open up your phone recorder, right? Point it at your screen. And then if you have these images split up into individual, right, you can just record and then do like some beatbox sound effects for your scene while you're recording to get a feel for how long it's going to be, right? So say if I'm doing this scene, it's like clomp, 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 clomp. The guy's running across this floor. I'm not going to narrate, but clomp, 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 clomp. Excuse me, sir, but what is the report on the satellite dish this morning? It's like, well, we don't quite know what the satellite's doing, but we're sure monitoring the situation, bud. Like that way you have a sense of how long each frame is going to be in play, right? And you can also start to think about what you're going to need for your sound asset list, for your 3D asset list. 3D asset list will come from the storyboard, but by doing a bit of sound effects voiceover, during while flipping between these storyboards, right? Again, just point your phone at it, split your images up, and then just like film yourself going through it. It'll give you the sense of like how long this is going to take to tell the story visually, right? So again, just like we looked in class on how to split these up in Photoshop, right? Just if you haven't split them up yet, split individual panels up into their own files, number the files, and then just flip through them on your computer while recording from your phone. Frames, or it's not really frames, it's more shot count, right? Or number of panels. When I did mine the other day, I reached like 10 really quickly, I feel like. So I did these ones the other day. I started out right in the middle here, right? I was like, all right, so I know that I want to have like this lander come down and then this soldier like come out of the lander, right? So I started with this one. I was just like, okay, the soldier emerges and he like scans the horizon, right? So I was like 1, 2, and then it's like, okay, we get a shot over the shoulder of the soldier scanning the horizon, right? Then we go for a close-up shot of the soldier's boot hitting a ramp as he's about to go down and explore. And right as he's about to do that, somebody cuts in front of him. So we get the second boot come down. We get a different camera angle to show that somebody just cut in front of him, right? That this other soldier is going to take the ramp before him. And they both like got this plan of being like number one, the first one on the moon or whatever it is. And then this other character glares at him, right? And then I was like, okay, so that's in there. What other cool stuff do I want? I want to have like the effect of this sci-fi door opening. So I'm going to need a panel for that. I also wanted to show some camera movement in here or some zooming, right? So I'll zoom from this close-up and zoom out in this particular shot. And then I was like, well, maybe I'll have a shot of the lunar lander thing like landing on the surface. And maybe even before that, I might have like the lander being shot out of like the mothership, So for me, I think 10, at least 10 to 15 is probably a good number, but start to time this stuff out early on again, because remember 30 seconds is our hard limit. Don't go over 30, please, please, please. You're making too much work for yourself, and people, interviewers or, the people who are going to be looking at your portfolio won't watch something longer than 30 seconds, trust me. So we want to keep it nice and short. 15 to 30 seconds, should be where your test lands. If you find that it's too long or that you've created more work than you think that you're able to do, kill some frames, right away. I was like, you know what? I'm not going to make an entire planet and a mothership for like 3 seconds worth of shot, right? Like, let's just go ahead and cut that right off the bat. Let's concentrate on like what's funny and what's important to the conflict, right? I want to see the conflict in your story. These can change, right, up until the point that we're actually implementing the animation, but it does give us a better idea of what we're making. Does the story come through, and is it worth telling? How much stuff we're gonna have to make to get that story out the door. Yeah. Try not to use 2 characters like I did. I'm going to use 2 identical soldiers, right? I'm probably just going to maybe change the color or something, or the helmet on one of them. Yeah. rather use one of the other conflict types like character versus nature, character versus the supernatural, and think about what you're gonna have to model to tell that story. So thanks, guys. Hopefully this was helpful information. I know that the technical side of stuff is a bit weird when you're not actually in the app. So do play with this stuff. Do test it out this weekend if you didn't do it right now, right? Spend an hour doing, some character stuff every day. Spend an hour in Maya every day or two. It's gonna go a lot easier and make a lot more sense if you take it slow like that than if you try to do these like 6-hour, 10-hour sessions at the end. That's when things go really wrong. So I've seen it happen too many times that now I like to front load a lot of this stuff. And then it gives us more time at the end to polish, so that we have something that we're proud of at the end of the day. All right, so thanks everybody. I see some DMs coming in via Discord, so I'll mark off people's homework as they turn in their storyboard stuff. And you can turn in the storyboards up until like 2 o'clock. I'll leave the gates open for the homework. And what did I say was going to be due at 5? Something else is going to be 5 o'clock. Oh, any of this classwork stuff. So just show me that you played around with your box character, right? And with smoothing. Just give me some evidence of that. Or if you did some sculpting on this character, you don't have to turn in a screen cap of everything. I just want to see that you're messing around with these files and that you did some of the exercises that are in the presentation, right? So whether it's playing with the smooth preview, sculpting on one of the high poly base meshes, right? Smoothing them out and testing some of these sculpting tools. As long as you're testing some of this out, I don't mind which way you're going. If you're going pure low poly, or if you're going to experiment with the high poly stuff, just know that doing the high poly stuff kind of increases your modeling time by about 3 times. It's about 3 times the amount of hours. So if you want a portfolio piece, it's worth it. If you think you're going to do this in the industry, that you like modeling, it's worth it. If you want to just get a cute animation at the end of the day, don't do the high poly stuff. Do the low poly. It's still going to be a bit of a slog, but it's going to be a lot easier. So thanks, everybody. I'll see you guys next week.